Good morning, students. Today we are continuing the same topic, that is the nervous system, in which the divisions of nervous system we are studying now. The nervous system is divided into central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and autonomic nervous system. The CNS includes brain and spinal cord. Then the PNS includes peripheral nerves and the ganglia. The ANS includes sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. The brain, we are studying now the brain. The brain is divided into three parts, that is the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is comprised of cerebrum and diencephalon. Cerebrum and diencephalon. And the midbrain consists of cerebral peduncles, tactum, superior and inferior colliculi. Then the hindbrain consists of cerebellum, pons varolii, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. So all these parts are present in the hindbrain. The first one, the forebrain, in which the cerebrum we have studied yesterday. The cerebrum is the first part of the forebrain, foremost, very important, major part of the brain, human brain. This is the major part of the human brain. It is the largest major part of the human brain. And this is divided into two hemispheres called right and left hemispheres. So we have studied already all the points. Coming to the diencephalon. Diencephalon is the second portion present in the forebrain. The forebrain consists of cerebellum and diencephalon. The diencephalon is the second important part. It is embedded in the cerebrum and a midline structure hidden in cerebrum. It is embedded in the cerebrum and midline structure hidden in cerebrum. It means that it is hidden inside the cerebrum. It cannot be seen outside. So if you take the section of the brain, then only you can see the diencephalon. Whereas orally or the superficial view and the side views will not show this portion, that is the diencephalon. But when you take the section of the brain, then you can see the diencephalon present inside, hidden inside the cerebrum. It is hidden inside the cerebrum. Its cavity is called third ventricle. The cavity of the diencephalon is called third ventricle. It consists of epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. It consists of main part, that is the thalamus, complete thalamus, in which the upper portion is the epithalamus and the second middle portion is called the thalamus and the downward portion is called hypothalamus. Very important parts of the diencephalon. The thalamus portion is a very important portion of the diencephalon. Now coming to the epithalamus, it is a roof of thalamus and diencephalon and non-nervous part. It is a non-nervous part. There are no neurons or the nerve ganglia or the neurons. Nerve fibers are also not there. It is a non-neurous part and it is the roof of the thalamus. It is called as the roof of the thalamus or the diencephalon. It is a non-nervous part. It contains the pineal gland. The pineal gland is present at the lateral side of the epithalamus. The pineal gland is attached to the epithalamus laterally. Now coming to the thalamus portion, it's a large mass of grey and white matter situated within the cerebrum, just below the corpus callosum one on each side of third ventricle and lies superior to the midbrain. It lies superior to the midbrain. It is major coordinating center for sensory and motor signals. So the motor signals and the sensory signals are coordinated by this center called as the thalamus portion of the forebrain. The sensory receptors in the skin and the viscera send informations about touch, pain and temperature. Touch, pain and temperature sensations are sent by skin and viscera from the sensory receptors through special sense organs to the thalamus. So all these informations are coming from the sensory receptors of the skin and the viscera about the touch, pain and the temperature. They are brought to the thalamus for recognition. So thalamus receives the sensory receptors informations from the skin and viscera. It relays and redistributes impulses from most parts of the brain to the cerebral cortex. It relays and redistributes the informations or the impulses which are brought to the thalamus portion. It receives them and relays them and redistribute them from most part of the brain to the cerebral cortex. Coming to the hypothalamus, it's a small structure but important part of the diencephalon. It is a very small structure present in the diencephalon, but it is a very, very important portion of the diencephalon, which weighs around 7 grams and consists of a number of nuclei. It weighs about 7 grams and contains number of nuclei. It is situated below and in front of thalamus, immediately above pituitary gland. It is present immediately above the pituitary gland in front of thalamus portion. It has been described as the chief ganglion of autonomic nervous system because it controls many metabolic activities of the body. So this hypothalamus portion of the diencephalon or the hypothalamus of the diencephalon is also called as autonomic nervous system or the chief ganglia of the autonomic nervous system because it controls many metabolic activities of the body. It controls almost all activities of the body. The thalamus controls many activities of the body and hence it is called the chief ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus is linked to the posterior pituitary by nerve fibers and to the anterior pituitary by blood vessels. By the blood vessels, it is connected to the anterior pituitary and it is also linked to the posterior pituitary by nerve fibers. Next point, the supraoptic nucleus lies above the optic chiasma, secretes antidiuretic hormone ADH. The supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus secretes the antidiuretic hormone, that is the ADH or the vasopressin, and thus it is an endocrine portion. The paraventricular nucleus lies just above the supraoptic nucleus, secretes oxytocin. The hormone oxytocin is secreted by the paraventricular nucleus and the ADH, that is the antidiuretic hormone vasopressin, it is called vasopressin, is secreted by the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. Now coming to the function of hypothalamus controls, coordinates uh, cardiovascular and respiratory and digestive systems. It controls cardiovascular, respiratory and digestive system functions. Almost all functions of the cardiovascular, respiratory and digestive are controlled by the hypothalamus gland or the hypothalamus secretions. It secretes releasing hormones that regulate thyroid, adrenal cortex, ovaries and anterior pituitary glands. It secretes the releasing hormones that regulate the thyroid gland, adrenal cortex portion of the gland, ovary gland and the anterior pituitary gland. So all these glands are controlled by releasing hormones of the hypothalamus. ADH and oxytocin secreted by hypothalamus are transported and stored in the posterior lobe of the pituitary. In the posterior lobe of the pituitary, the hormones produced by the thalamus gland, hypothalamus gland, that is ADH and oxytocin, are stored in the posterior pituitary. The anterior part of the hypothalamus is mainly concerned with regulation of parasympathetic system. The anterior portion of the hypothalamus is mainly concerned with the regulation of parasympathetic system, and the posterior part with sympathetic system. It regulates temperature, food and water intake, controlled by feeding centers and thirst centers. It contains the feeding centers and the thirst centers, by which it regulates the temperature, food and water intake. Food and water intake is also controlled by this portion, that is the hypothalamus. It controls sexual behavior and reproduction. It also controls the sexual behaviors of the human being. The male and the female sexual behaviors are controlled by hypothalamus secretions, and the reproduction is also controlled by this portion, that is the hypothalamus gland. It controls emotional reactions like pleasure, fear, violent anger, sexual arousal, that is nothing but a sexual excitement, the sexual excitement. It controls the emotional reactions also, the emotional reactions like pleasure, fear, sexual arousals. All these emotional reactions are controlled by the hypothalamus gland. It controls biological cycles like sleeping and walking. The biological cycles, sleeping and walking, are controlled by this gland, hypothalamus gland secretions. Coming to the midbrain, the midbrain consists of cerebral peduncles, tactum, superior and inferior colliculi. All this comprises the middle brain, that is the midbrain. Midbrain is also called as mesencephalon, 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 which is shortest segment of the brain located between thalamus and pons. It is located between thalamus and pons varolii. The cerebral aqueduct passes through the center of the midbrain. It passes through the center of the midbrain. So the midbrain this is the midbrain, which contains the first portion from here up till here and from here to here. So these are the two portions of the midbrain, and this is the aqueduct which passes in the midline, and there is one more important structure present in the middle of this one, and there is again one more structure coming this place. So this is the midbrain, which contains all the parts. So the midbrain is also called mesencephalon, and shortest segment of the brain, located between thalamus and the pons. The cerebral aqueduct passes through the center of the midbrain. The part of the midbrain lying above the imaginary transverse line drawn through the cerebral aqueduct is called tactum. The first portion is called tactum, the above portion above the imaginary line passing through the aqueduct. The part of the midbrain lying above the imaginary transverse line drawing through the cerebral aqueduct is called tactum. Likewise, the part below the line is made up of right and left cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles are posterior to the tactum. The first portion is the tactum, and next is the pair of cerebral peduncles. Next point, the aqueduct is surrounded by grey matter. The aqueduct is surrounded by grey matter, which contains nuclei of third and fourth cranial nerves. It contains the nuclei of the third and the fourth cranial nerves. The tactum is made up of a pair of superior colliculi and a pair of inferior colliculi. Superior and inferior colliculi are present in the tactum. So the tactum is made up of superior and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi is concerned with visual pathway. The visual pathway, the messages from the visual portion, they come to the superior colliculi, and the inferior colliculi is concerned with the auditory pathway. The auditory pathway comes to the inferior colliculi. The serous cerebri is made up of descending fibers. The serous cerebri is made up of descending fibers. Coming to the hindbrain, the hindbrain consists of cerebellum, pons varolii, medulla oblongata, and the spinal cord. All these parts, they comprise the hindbrain. Now coming to the first one, that is the cerebellum. Cerebellum means a little brain. Cerebellum means little brain. It's the largest part of the hindbrain and second largest part of the brain. It is situated behind the pons and below the occipital lobe of cerebrum in the posterior cranial cavity fossa. In the posterior cranial cavity of the fossa, this cerebellum is situated behind the pons and below the occipital lobe. It separates by tentorum cerebelli, a fluid of tentorum cerebelli, a file of dura, a fold of dura. Cerebellum is divided into two hemispheres joined together by a worm-like portion, the vermis. The vermis divides this cerebellum into two hemispheres. The cerebellum has an outer layer of grey matter and the inner layer of white matter, which is branched tree-like appearance. Inside the white matter, there are four pairs of nuclei. Four pairs of nuclei present in the white matter. The first one is vestigial, second is globose, then third is emboliform, and the fourth is dentate. So four different types of nuclei are present in the white matter of the midbrain. The cerebellum is connected on either side of the pons, that is the brain stem. The pons varolii is also called as the brain stem, by bundles of fibers called cerebellar peduncles. The cerebellar peduncles, they attach the cerebellum or connect the cerebellum on either side of the pons. Functions. The cerebellum's main function is to control and coordinate the various movements. The various movements of the body are controlled by the cerebellum. The main function of the cerebellum is to control the various movements of the body. It controls and coordinates the various movements of the body, for which it receives informations from cerebral cortex, vestibular region, auditory and visual receptors. It receives the informations from cerebral cortex, vestibulars and auditory and visual receptors. It maintains the balance and muscle movement. It maintains the muscle movement and the balance. It controls all movements of the skeletal voluntary muscles by its motor neurons. It controls the movements of skeletal voluntary muscles by its motor neurons. It receives sensation of pain or pressure from the skin, joints and other tissues. It receives the sensation of pain, from skin, joints and other tissues. The pressure and the pain of present in the skin, joints and in tissues is received by the sensation of this all received by this portion, that is the cerebellum. Coming to the next point, it controls all movements of skeletal voluntary muscles by its motor neurons. Then it also receives sensation from special sense of sight, hearing, taste, smell and touch. Special sense organs sensation is also received by this portion. It contains centers of mental power like consciousness, memory, intelligence, language and speech, reasoning power, will, self-control and emotions. Almost all emotional sensations are controlled by this portion. Coming to the next one, the second one of the hindbrain, that is the pons varolii. The pons varolii is a very important part. So the pons varolii, the midbrain, pons and medulla oblongata are collectively called as brain stem. The midbrain, pons varolii, medulla oblongata, all together called as brain stem. The brain stem consists of midbrain, pons varolii, medulla oblongata, which connects the forebrain and spinal cord. This pons varolii connects the forebrain and the spinal cord. Next point, the pons varolii is located in front of cerebellum, below the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata. It is situated or located, the pons varolii is located in front of cerebellum, below the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata. The word pons means bridge. The word pons means bridge, which is made up of mainly nerve fibers of white matter that form a bridge between the two hemispheres of cerebellum. The two hemispheres of the cerebellum are connected by this bridge. It is the main connection between the cerebellum and brain stem. The bride-like white matter is the anterior surface of pons, whereas the grey matter beneath is the continuation of the midbrain, which contains neurons that receive impulses from forebrain and sent to the cerebellum. The pons processes the informations from fifth cranial nerve, that is sensory informations from face, scalp, mouth and nose, and motor control of chewing, and eighth cranial nerve, that is hearing and balancing. It processes the informations from the fifth and the eighth cranial nerves. So the details I have already told you. The fifth cranial nerve, that is sensory informations from face, scalp, mouth and and nose, and the motor control of chewing, and eighth cranial nerves, that is hearing and balancing. So these are the works done by this one. Then coming to the next point, it also contains the nematotoxic area that operates the respiratory center of the medulla oblongata and controls the respiration process. It also controls the respiration process. Coming to the medulla oblongata, medulla means bulb. Medulla means bulb. It is the posterior part of the brain, extends from the pons varolii and continues below the spinal cord, located within the cranium. It is located within the cranium. Posteriorly, it is related to the fourth ventricle. It is related to the fourth ventricle posteriorly. Its anterior and posterior surfaces are marked by central fissures. The central fissures are markings present on the anterior and the posterior surface of the medulla oblongata. On either side of the anterior fissure, there are swellings called pyramids. The pyramids are present, which are nothing but the swellings of the medulla oblongata on the either side of the anterior portion, anterior fissure. The outer part of the medulla is composed of white matter, which passes between brain and spinal cord, and the central part is composed of grey matter, which is responsible for processing cranial nerves informations. The vital centers like respiratory and vasomotor are situated in the medulla. the last cranial nerves, that is 9th, 10th and 10th, 11th and 12th, emerge out from medulla oblongata. The cranial nerves 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th, 4 cranial nerves, they emerge out from the medulla portion. The ascending and descending tracts pass through the medulla. Ascending and descending tracts of these cranial nerves pass through the medulla. Medulla is supplied with anterior spinal arteries and posterior inferior cerebral arteries. Medulla is supplied by the anterior spinal arteries. In the deeper structure of medulla, the vital centers consisting of cell bodies, that is nuclei, which are associated with autonomic reflex activities are present. They are cardiovascular center, respiratory center, reflex centers of vomiting, coughing, sneezing and swallowing. All these centers are present in the medulla oblongata. Damage to vital centers leads to death. Bulbar paralysis is by paralysis of muscles supplied by the last 4 cranial nerves. Bulbar paralysis is by paralysis of muscles supplied by the last 4 cranial nerves. So that is one of the disease, that is a bulbar paralysis caused by the paralysis of muscles of cranial nerves. Then damage to the vital centers leads to death. So this is all about the hind brain. Then one more is there, that is the 4th one, spinal cord. The last is the spinal cord present in the hind brain, or the last portion of the brain. Now the brain is made up of forebrain, midbrain and the hind brain, and the hind brain consists of cerebellum, pons varolii, medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. So we'll stop here. Tomorrow I will take the spinal cord and the structure of the spinal cord and the functions of the spinal cord. So thank you very much.